Crime is a very important social problem, and people are very, very afraid of crime. As you can see from the chart here, a substantial proportion of Americans are afraid of crime. And plenty of space is taken up in newspapers and during newscasts to talk about the crime problem. And fighting crime is a favorite project of politicians because everyone is afraid of crime. Think of how much time we spend thinking about crime. Think about the fact that certain criminals are celebrities and household names in our society. If I say names like Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, you know who these people are. Think about how many primetime television shows there are that are devoted to crime and criminal activity. Well, how should we think about crime as sociologists? And how can we measure how much crime there really is? In this lecture, we're going to talk about the nature and extent of crime. How much crime is there, and what are the trends in crime in the United States? The agency tasked with computing the crime rate and tabulating crimes is the FBI. And every year they publish something called the Uniform Crime Reports, or the UCR. And these are a record of crimes known to the police. And there are a series of crimes that are the most serious crimes that are called the index offenses, or the Part 1 offenses. There are two parts to the UCR, Part 1 and Part 2. And the Part 1 offenses are aggravated assault, criminal homicide, robbery, rape. These are the violent crimes. And then burglary, larceny, which is basic theft, auto theft, and in 1978 arson was added. And these are the property crimes. All other crimes are known as Part 2 offenses, things like prostitution, or drugs, embezzlement, all other crimes except traffic violations, things like that. Those are Part 2 offenses. So the index crimes, or the Part 1 offenses, those are how the crime rate is computed. When people say the crime rate went up or the crime rate went down, they're talking about the rate of index offenses went up or down. Or when people talk about the violent crime rate, they're talking about the sum of the aggravated assault, criminal homicide, robbery, and rape rate. When they talk about property crime, they're talking about the sum of the burglary, larceny, auto theft, and arson rates. So these are the crimes that constitute the crime rate. Now, right off the bat, you can see some problems with this because there are lots of crimes that are fairly common and fairly serious that don't show up in the crime index. Rates of heroin sales could go up and down, and it wouldn't be tabulated in the UCR because that's not one of the index offenses, or it would be a Part 2 offense. So these are the crimes that constitute the crime rate. The crime rate is standardized for the population, and there's a particular formula that's used. And it is the number of reported crimes for any type of crime or group of crimes divided by the population of the ecological unit that you're examining, whether it's a city or a county or a state, times 100,000. And we'll get to the 100,000 part in a minute. But by dividing by the population, you get a per capita crime rate. So if you want the murder rate, then murder would be in the numerator. If you want the violent crime rate, then murder, rape, aggravated assault, and robbery would be in the numerator. If you wanted to look at a particular city, that city's population would be in the denominator. If you wanted to look at a state, then the state's population, or the whole country's population, if you wanted to look at the nation, would be in the denominator. Now, the reason why we multiply by 100,000 is because some crimes are very rare. Murder, for instance, as we'll see, is a fairly uncommon crime, despite how often it's portrayed on television. And so if you just looked at the number of murders divided by the population, murder rates would look something like 0.0004 or something like that. And so to express them in whole numbers, you multiply by 100,000, and this gives you a rate of offense per 100,000 people per year. So if the murder rate is 7 for a particular city, that means that for every 100,000 residents in that city, there were 7 murders for that year. And this allows you to compare places with large populations and places with small populations, because the crime rate is standardized for population. So as you can see, in terms of the volume of crime, last year New York City had 196,000 index crimes, whereas Jacksonville only had 40,000. And you look at that and say, wow, that is a huge difference. There were many, many more index crimes in New York City than there were in Jacksonville. But New York City's population is almost 10 times Jacksonville. So when you look at the crime rate, the rate of index offenses per 100,000 people, what you see is that Jacksonville's crime rate is almost twice as high as New York City's crime rate, because it is standardized for the population. So even though the volume of crime is much lower in Jacksonville, the rate of crime is much higher. Look at a small city like Atlantic City with only 40,000 people, but look at the size of that crime rate, 22,321 index crimes per 100,000 residents. So you can see that crime, the volume of crime and the rate of crime are not always closely linked. The distribution of crimes is also important to note. As you can see, what I have done is put them all into a pie chart with each slice showing how common they are. And the red tones are the property crimes, and the blue color are the violent crimes. And what you can see is that something like between, in a typical year, something like 85 to 90% of crime is property crime. And larceny, which is simple theft, constitutes almost 2/3 of all index offenses. The violent crimes, maybe 15%, 10% of all crimes. And even within the violent crimes, murder, which is the most common crime on primetime TV, is incredibly rare. It constitutes 0.1% of index crimes. You can see that there are, hundreds of times more larcenies and burglaries than there are homicides. And these are numbers for the nation, and this is pretty stable from year to year. The distribution of index offenses in Jacksonville looks very similar to the distribution of index offenses nationwide. You can see that theft, larceny, constitutes a majority of index offenses, and you can see that the tiny little wedge in the pie chart for murder is almost invisible, because it is by far the rarest crime. And so Jacksonville, like most cities, looks a lot like the nation in terms of the distribution of index offenses. Here we have two charts, disaggregated, property crimes and violent crimes, so you can get a little better view of the distribution of each crime type. As you can see, the more serious crime, the less common it is. Aggravated assault constitutes about 2/3 of violent crime. Larceny, theft, between 2/3 and 3/4 of property crime. And of course, murder, the rarest of all crimes. There's also regional distributions in the crime rate and the frequency of crime. On the left, you see regional crime rates from 2014, and what they show is that the South has the highest crime rates, and the Northeast has the lowest crime rates, and the West and the Midwest are in between. And this state of affairs has persisted for decades, with the South having the highest crime rates and the Northeast having the lowest crime rates. But then, for the latest UCR figures in 2015, the map on the right, the West and the South switched places for the first time in a very long time. And the Western United States has higher overall crime rates than the South. Now, the South still has slightly higher violent crime rates, but the West, in terms of overall crime, has overtaken the South. And there are lots of theories about why this might be the case, about why there are so many regional differences. Some people have argued that it's related to climate, that warmer weather is more conducive to committing crime. I mean, in Miami, there's a 12-month robbing season, whereas nobody is going to wait in an alley to rob you in January in Duluth, Minnesota. And if you look at the western United States, what you see is that New Mexico, Arizona, and the coastal states, which are warmer, have higher crime rates than Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah, which are colder. So it could be climate. People have postulated there are cultural differences. If you take a criminology class, I'm sure they will discuss the theories behind the various regional differences in crime rates. If you look at international comparisons, what you generally see is that the United States has higher crime rates than most other Western democracies, higher than Canada, Australia, Sweden, and the kinds of nations that we often compare ourselves to, economically developed first world nations. This chart shows homicide rates, and what you see is that the United States is a little bit higher than some other nations, other mostly rich nations, but it is substantially lower than South American nations, African nations, and you can see very high homicide rates in Latin America compared to the United States. So generally, comparing to Western Europe, higher crime rates in the United States. Comparing to other nations on the continent besides Canada, lower rates of crime in the United States. The overall trend in crime in the United States is that since about the mid-1990s, the crime rate has been falling, and all types of crime have been falling. What you see here on the left is the rate of violent crime. You can see starting at about 1993, the rate of violent crime began to fall precipitously. On the far right, you see property crime. Same story. Property crime rates now as low as they have ever been in the era of modern crime measurement. In the center, you see the homicide rate, which follows a similar pattern from violent crime, but in the last couple of years, 2015, 2016, there's been a slight uptick in the murder rate, but it's too soon to tell whether this is just statistical noise, whether the murder rate is probably as low as it can possibly be and we're sort of scraping along a bumpy bottom, or whether homicide rates herald a return to a new trend of rising crime. Too soon to tell. But at any rate, the murder rate presently, even though it's higher than it was in 2014, 2013, is still dramatically, spectacularly lower than it was in the 1990s. So crime rates nationwide have fallen over the past 2 decades and fallen precipitously. Like the nation at large, crime rates in Florida have also fallen. And crime rates in Florida, both property crime and violent crime rates, have followed the same patterns that they have followed for the nation at large. So Florida looks like a microcosm of the United States in general. And Jacksonville follows the same pattern as well. The graph with the red bars is the violent crime rate from 2008 to 2011. Those were the only years that I could find. And the graph with the blue bars is the property crime rate. The line graph is the overall rate of index offenses over the last 20 years. And you can see there's some bumpiness, but overall the trend has been declining rates of all kinds of index crimes. This gives you a sense of just how much crime declined in New York. This chart shows murder in New York. The gray bars show the population of the city, and you can see that the population rose throughout the 90s and into the 21st century. And the orange bars show the number of homicides. And you can see that murders peaked in the early 90s and then fell off dramatically through the late 90s, and they continued falling at a slower pace in the 21st century and have fallen just about every year until in 2016 they're near the lowest they have ever been. You can compare the rate of 2016 on the extreme right of the chart with 1960 on the extreme left of the chart and see that in terms of your odds of being murdered in New York City, they are substantially less. I mean, the murder rate is lower in terms of the number of murders, and the population compared to 1960 is much larger. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about, that the crime rate in the United States right now is substantially lower than it was for most college students' parents' generation. And here what we see is that people's perceptions of crime does not comport with the reality of crime. The graph on the left shows that a large percentage of Americans say that there's more crime in the United States than there was a year ago. And yet, the chart on the right shows that crimes have declined quite dramatically. So there's less and less crime, but people think there's more and more. So why did the crime rate fall? There are many theories. One theory is that gross increases in incarceration in the United States put so many people in prison that pretty much all the bad guys were put away. The American system of criminal justice began a program of massive incarceration beginning just before the crime rate began to fall. And the idea is, if you cast a wide net, if you just start incarcerating people at very high rates, you're going to get lots and lots of criminals. Now, you're also going to get lots of people who don't necessarily belong in prison or belong in prison for long periods of time. But if you look at this graph and look at when incarceration began to increase, and if you compare it to the crime rate graph and look at when crime began to decrease, I would say the fact that one graph is the inverse of the other makes a prima facie case that increased incarceration had some effect on the crime rate, although there are a number of other explanations as well. Here you can see the rate of incarceration, which is the green bar, green in the graph, that is superimposed over the motor vehicle theft rate, the burglary rate, and the homicide rate. And you can see that the crime rates began to fall, and that coincides with the incarceration rate beginning to rise. And that is why many criminologists think that gross incapacitation, putting many people in prison, which many criminologists say might not be a great idea, but it seems to have been somewhat effective in lowering the crime rate. Although, again, there are other explanations that have been put forward for why the crime rate fell. Whenever someone is arrested for a crime, or if a known perpetrator dies, or some other circumstance where they know who did the crime is said to be cleared by arrest. And here you see the rate of clearance for various crimes. As you can see, the violent crimes, murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, these have much higher clearance rates than the property crimes, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft. One reason why violent crimes are more likely to be cleared by arrest is because because they're violent crimes, they're interpersonal crimes. The victim sees the perpetrator. You see the person who held you up in an alley. You see the person who beat you up. A lot of times victims know the perpetrators personally. Women who are raped are very often raped by people that they know, by their boyfriends, by their husbands, by ex-boyfriends. And so because of the interpersonal nature of violent crime, there are witnesses. With respect to murder, a dead body provides a wealth of evidence, and it is well known among homicide investigators that when you see a dead body, you should generally go looking for that person's associates, because murder victims tend to be killed by people they know, business partners, ex-husbands, things like that. Another reason why violent crimes have a higher clearance rate is because the police put more energy into those crimes because they're considered more serious. But still, look at some of those clearance rates. Murder has the highest clearance rate at 64%. But what that means is that 1/3 of all murders, 1/3, nobody's even arrested. 1 in 3 murders is completely unsolved. And something like 85% of burglaries are completely unsolved to the point where no one is even arrested.